Okay, let's talk about public speaking. For a lot of us, just hearing those two words is enough to make our palms sweat. It's funny, it consistently ranks as one of our biggest phobias, right up there with death and snakes. So today we're going to dig into this really common fear, and we're going to do it by looking through psychology's 7 modern perspectives.
You know, the comedian Jerry Seinfeld absolutely nailed the absurdity of it all with this joke. And it's so funny because, well, it feels kind of true, doesn't it? The idea that we'd rather be the one in the casket than the one giving the eulogy, that just shows you how deep this fear really runs in our culture.
So, this all leads to a really big question. I mean, think about it. Standing up in front of a crowd isn't like you're facing down a lion. You're not in any actual physical danger. So why on earth does our body react as if we are? Why is this particular fear so incredibly common?
To solve this little mystery, we're going to use the very same tools that psychologists use. I want you to think of these 7 perspectives as different lenses, like tools in a detective's kit. Each one is going to give us a unique angle on the problem. So let's start unpacking the evidence.
First up, we have the behavioral perspective. This viewpoint basically says that our fears aren't something we're born with. Nope, they're built piece by piece from the experiences we have in our lives.
So the core idea of behaviorism is pretty simple. We learn from our environment. We're sort of wired to repeat actions that get us good results and, to avoid the ones that get us bad results. It all comes down to rewards, punishments, and making associations.
Okay, so imagine this. You're in school, you have to give a presentation. You stumble over a word, and a couple of kids in the back start laughing. Well, from a behavioral perspective, your brain has just created a powerful link between public speaking and the awful feeling of embarrassment. That one little moment can be enough to condition a fear that sticks with you for years. But what if it's not just about what happens to us? Let's switch to our next lens, the cognitive perspective. This one argues that what we think about our experiences is maybe even more important than the experiences themselves. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Behaviorism kind of sees us as passive creatures, just responding to whatever our environment throws at us. But cognitivism comes along and says, hold on a second, we're not just robots. We are actively thinking, interpreting, and making decisions. Our thoughts are what really shape our feelings and our actions. So the cognitive perspective would say the fear of public speaking is really a firestorm of these irrational negative thoughts. It's that little voice in your head that just won't be quiet, right? It creates this endless loop of what-ifs that just spirals into anxiety before you even walk up to the microphone. All right, let's dive into one of the most fascinating and definitely one of the most controversial perspectives in all of psychology. We're going way below the surface now with the psychodynamic view. The big idea here is the unconscious mind. Think of it like an iceberg. We're only aware of the little tips sticking out of the water. The huge, hidden part underneath is where the real action is. It's filled with repressed memories, usually from our childhood, and all these primitive urges that we can't act on. So a psychodynamic psychologist might argue that your fear of being on stage has almost nothing to do with the stage itself. No, it's actually about a deeper, unconscious fear of rejection. Maybe it comes from a repressed memory of being harshly criticized by a parent or a teacher when you were a little kid. You don't consciously remember it, but your unconscious mind definitely does. Okay, but what if our fears aren't just about old traumas or bad associations? Let's look at a much more optimistic approach. This is the humanistic perspective, and it suggests we have a lot more control than we think. So humanists basically came in and rejected the idea that we're controlled by our unconscious or just by rewards and punishments. They believe we have free will. We make choices, and we're always striving to become our best selves. For them, the glass is definitely half full.
So from this point of view, the fear of public speaking isn't some flaw you need to fix. It's a challenge, an opportunity. It's a mountain you can choose to climb. And overcoming that fear, that's a huge moment of personal growth, a real triumph.
All right, let's switch gears completely and get into the nuts and bolts. The biological perspective reminds us that everything psychological is, at its root, also biological. It's about the hardware.
So what's actually happening inside your body when you feel that dread? Well, when your brain perceives a threat, a tiny almond-shaped area called the amygdala hits the panic button. This triggers a flood of stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine, and that's what causes your heart to pound, your palms to get sweaty, all those physical feelings of fear. It's just a raw physical threat response.
But of course, our biology doesn't exist in a bubble. The sociocultural perspective asks us to look at how the world we live in, our society, our culture, shapes how we feel.
Think about it. Our fear can be influenced by our culture's unwritten rules. Stuff like how much eye contact is okay, or how much emotion you're allowed to show in public. And in highly individualistic cultures, there's also this huge pressure to succeed all by yourself, which can really crank up the fear of failing in front of everybody.
For our final lens, we're going to get in our time machine and travel way, way back with the evolutionary perspective.
You see, evolutionary psychologists argue that our modern brains are still running on some very ancient software. To our primitive, survival-focused brain, being stared at by 100 strangers feels an awful lot like being cornered by a predator. It can't tell the difference. It reads that social threat as a life-or-death situation, and it kicks off the exact same fight-or-flight response that would have saved our ancestors from a saber-toothed tiger.
So we've looked through all 7 of these lenses. So which one is right? Well, the real answer is all of them. Each one gives us a piece of the story. Let's put all the clues together and see the complete picture.
You see, each perspective adds another layer to our understanding. The fear could be a learned response, fueled by our own negative thoughts, driven by an ancient survival instinct that's misfiring, and shaped by cultural pressures. And it could be all of those things happening at the exact same time. Together, they give us this really rich, complete picture of a very, very common human experience.
And that brings us to the end. But I want to leave you with a final thought. Think about a fear that you have. It could be public speaking, heights, spiders, anything. As you look back at these 7 lenses, which one clicks for you? Which one do you think best explains where that fear really comes from?